When we think of the Final Fantasy series, Final Fantasy V is probably not the game that comes to mind. This is likely because the game skipped a Western release entirely, which resulted in the confusing renumbering of many of the early entries until the record was set straight in 1999, when it was released for the PlayStation in the form of Final Fantasy Anthology. This is a sad fate because the game actually pioneered a lot of features that remain in the series' DNA to this day. For example, redefining Final Fantasy III's famous job system, introducing new classes like the Blue Mage and the Time Mage, and giving Gilgamesh his identity of being a punishing super boss. Not to mention his epic theme song. I mean, frickin' listen to this. The story was more epic than any Final Fantasy to that point, with the colorful cast of characters traversing multiple planets, and even time and space to vanquish the reawakened villain, X-Death. I mean, who needs Sephiroth when you have X-Death? His name is X-Death! But despite all this, nowadays Final Fantasy V is all but forgotten, buried under the noise of high-profile remakes, overshadowed by the fame of the likes of Cloud Strife, washed out by Titus's laughter. But you know what's even more forgotten than Final Fantasy V? Final Fantasy V 2. Never heard of it? Well, that makes sense because it's not actually called Final Fantasy V 2, but it does exist in the form of a little 4-episode anime miniseries called Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals. Technically, it's called Legend of the Crystals based on Final Fantasy, but, whatever. Check this out. A lot of spin-offs like this tend to be cheap stories, barely related to the source material that just use the brand name as a cash grab. And while Legend of the Crystals is true to its name and only based on Final Fantasy, it actually does a pretty good job directly connecting to Final Fantasy V's story, while still managing to stand on its own 2 feet surprisingly well. It is indeed a true sequel, a direct continuation of the story, complete with flashbacks to the Warriors of Light, revisiting locations from the game, and even featuring a few returning characters. The story takes place in the same world 200 years after the events of Final Fantasy V. It even begins the same way, opening with the iconic theme song and a Star Wars-esque recap of the outcome of Final Fantasy V's story. Just like the original, we then start with an elderly man leaving on a quest to the Temple of the Wind to investigate the dwindling power of the crystals, with his young granddaughter insisting on coming along. The characters themselves end up being deliberate echoes of the original game's party. In place of the free-spirited Bartz and his faithful Chocobo Boko, you have the hot-headed Pretz with his massive sword and trusty motorbike. In place of Lena, you have Lenali, who is a summoner and actually a direct descendant of Bartz. The role of the quirky old man Galuf is filled by the loud and abrasive General Valkus of Tycoon Kingdom, which has survived all these years. Rounding out the team is yet another female pirate to replace Ferris. Her name is Rouge, and just like with the Warriors of Light 200 years ago, starts as an enemy and later turns ally. Unlike her Warrior of Light counterpart, however, she most definitely is never mistaken for a man. Even Mid, the studious grandson of Cid from the original game, features as a main character in the form of a ghost. The animation is surprisingly high quality for a 1994 side project. It even boasts some medium star power, in the English dub at least, with Matt Miller of Tenchi Muyo fame voicing Pretz and John DeMita voicing Valkus, who has done a crap ton of live-action movies, anime, and other video games, including other Final Fantasies. As far as the storyline is concerned, it's essentially a simple retelling of the OG game. A new threat called Death Gyunos has succeeded in stealing all the crystals but one, driven by a need to become god of the universe after stealing the brain of Cid from Final Fantasy V. Naturally, these new characters are chosen by Queen Lena of Tycoon, yes, a descendant of the original Lena, to be the new heroes of light, and there you have it. Some of the same story beats are present here too, like recruiting a dragon mount, going into outer space, and of course, wrecking the end boss with a hype-inducing killer blow. Despite the deep Final Fantasy lore, some pretty cool action sequences, and a handful of truly laugh-out-loud moments.
Oh, and you can stop pretending you're asleep!
This sequel to Final Fantasy V could probably be considered a fairly mediocre anime to most when looked at objectively. Its short runtime makes for some awkward pacing, there's some really weird fan service moments, etc., but nevertheless it holds a very special place in my heart. For starters, it was my very first introduction to the world of anime and Japanese culture, which would eventually lead me to become a martial arts instructor, illustrator, learn Japanese, and live in Japan for several years. In a weird way, this somewhat obscure show changed the course of my life. I'm gonna date myself a bit, but back in the early 90s, Japanese anime was more of an underground subculture. Not many knew what it was, and those of us that did would get our fix from swapping ripped copies on VHS tapes at hole-in-the-wall cult movie stores. At that time, I was already a fan of Final Fantasy IV through 8, so when I heard there was a Final Fantasy cartoon, I had to investigate, and the rest is history. Considering this all happened in late junior high, this all fell at that kind of magical time in life when you're discovering who you are and having the best of times with your friends and just living life to the fullest. So in other words, there's a lot of nostalgia tied to this little corner of the Final Fantasy ethos for me. Naturally, over the years, I've managed to collect some pretty cool Legend of the Crystals relics. First of all, I of course still have my original VHS set from the now bankrupt distributor Urban Vision. Sadly, there is no official Western DVD or Blu-ray release, but it can be imported from Japan as far as I understand. I just burned a DVD with both language tracks on it. Next, during my time in Japan, I was somehow able to randomly encounter the manga adaptation, which is just 2 volumes comprised of full-color stills from the show, but really cool nonetheless. I was delighted to find that these manga included 2 fold-out posters, which I was able to scan, clean off the crease lines, blow up, and print onto foam board. You can see them in the background of my videos. There they are. And last, but certainly not least, is this sucker right here. A 6-foot replica of Pretz's Odachi sword. I know what you're wondering, where did you get it, and how much did it cost? Well, it didn't really cost me anything because I made it. About 15 years ago, a buddy of mine had a dad with a metal shop, so in we went to make weapons. The blade is full tang, 1 solid piece of sharpened carbon steel that goes right down to the pommel, which is just a metal pipe cap fitting from the hardware store. The handle is a wooden dowel cut in half vertically, sanded flat, and bolted into the tang at 3 points. The wrapping is a 50-cent red t-shirt from the thrift store, cut and woven into the Hinari Maki pattern, then hardened with floor tile sealant. The sheath is a PVC pipe melted down with a heat gun while pressed in a vise and then painted black. It's one of a kind to say the least. It's not light and would be pretty much impossible to wield in any kind of real fight, but it looks cool and it could probably chop a car in half. And what, my friends, could be more Final Fantasy than that? So there you have it. Believe it or not, these 4 animated episodes marked the very first direct sequel in the Final Fantasy series history. Did you know it existed? Are you gonna go watch it now? Because, I mean, it's all over YouTube, so it's pretty easy to find. If you do, I sure hope you get some of the enjoyment I did when I first watched it nearly 25 years ago.